All right. Next part is so the Jewish people are back in the Holy Land and everything's good. And finally, the Greeks come. Now, here is a situation where you have um, the Greeks. They conquer by Hellenism. If you remember from your global courses back in high school, Hellenism is where the Greeks shared their culture and expected you to kind of buy in. Now, for most people, it was super exciting because the Greek culture was so much fun. They had the Olympics, and everybody was were doing all these sports naked, and the food was good, and it's all good. But the Hebrews, the Jews, had all of these rules, right? They had all of these Jewish laws, and they were pretty strict. And so there were foods they couldn't eat, and there were things they couldn't do, and they couldn't go to the games. And the Greeks were kind of puzzled, and was like, well, what? This is dumb. Just come and do what we want you to do because you'll love it. And the Jews were like, no, we're not going to do this. And so a group called the Maccabees got together, and they were a series of brothers, and they organized the Jews to fight back against the Greeks. Now, when you're talking about this, the Greek Empire was monstrous, and all you had was this little Jewish group, this little Jewish kingdom that was not organized, and they were just like a compared to it was imagine you're sitting there typing a paper, right? And all of a sudden a fly comes around you and you like swat it away, right? And the flies over there and you're like, um, you get the flies keep bothering you, so you get up to try to kill it, and you're trying to kill the fly or whatever, and suddenly now you're going off into another room to go kill this fly, and then you get to the point where um, you realize that you're chasing a fly across the whole house, and you realize this is dumb, and you just leave the fly and you go back to typing your paper. Well, did the fly win? The fly might have thought that they won, and this, in some ways, is how the war of the Maccabees versus the Greeks kind of went. Is the Greeks they fought the Jewish people for a little while, but they turned around and realized this was not worth it, and so they granted the Jews a waiver that they didn't have to follow the Greek gods and all of the Hellenism stuff, and it just was easier. Just just leave us alone. Go over there in your corner and do your Jewish thing, and we won't bother with you. And so the Jews were like, "Yay, we beat the Greeks," which you know. Hmm. Now, one of the stories here is Hanukkah. This is where, um, in the middle of this war, the Maccabees were held up in the temple, and the Greeks laid siege to it. And what ended up happening was they looked up and they saw this candle that was there and supposed to represent God's presence, and the candle was only a 1 day candle, and they were sad because this was representing God's presence. And after the day, they knew that it would burn out, and symbolically it would be as if God abandoned them. And so they woke up in the next morning and the candle was still lit, right? And they were amazed. And then they went to sleep the next night, and they woke up and there it was lit. And again, it was still lit. This candle didn't go out. And so for 8 nights, right? 8 crazy nights, this candle was lit, symbolizing God's presence was always with them. And so they and then after the eighth day, the Greeks went away. The Jews got reinforcements, and all was good. Now, moving from the Greeks to the Romans, you see my analogy here would be if when you sell a house, right? You sell the house to some other family, and usually there's a point where like you kind of walk through the house with the person who just bought your house, and you kind of explain how things work, right? Like, okay, this light is really tricky, and you got to make sure that the light switch you always push it all the way up, and or this pipe needs to be turned this way or whatever, and this always tends to be this way. You kind of give them like the details of how the house kind of runs, and in some ways that's kind of what the Greeks did for the Romans. right? As the Romans were taking over power, the Greeks were like, "Oh yeah, here's what you do with this or that," and they're like, "Oh yeah, by the way, the Jews, we gave them this waiver. They're kind of a pain in the butt. Just keep up this waiver, and they'll just kind of they won't bother you." And so the Romans like, "Oh, thanks." So they kept this waiver where the Jews could worship as they wanted, and that was what. And that is where that was. And Rome took over and they demanded taxes, and everything was just about what it was when Jesus was born and the New Testament starts. So that's really the end of the story of the Old Testament. Right? Now, it's not the end of the story of the Jews. In about 70 AD, situation is, again, this is after Jesus has, died and been risen from the dead. Um, the the Romans try to go ahead and put an idol in the temple, and the Jews go nuts. And and there's a battle, and then the Romans are mad because the Jews are causing trouble, and so they go in and they destroy Jerusalem. They knock down the temple, and and so the Jews flee, and they flee all across the world, sometimes to Egypt, sometimes to Greece, sometimes to Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, all the way to Spain. So there's Jews everywhere, and this going out is called the diaspora, and that's an important topic. That is, oh, I forgot to kind of open and make it bigger, but I think you're okay. All right, there we go. But we're going to move on. So after the diaspora, the temple was destroyed. The structure of the priesthood who took care of the temple was gone. People were spread out. Spirituality had to kind of be brought together. And so the Jews decided they were going to have a council in this place called Jamnia, right on the coast here. And so they got together and they said, we can't have Judaism without consistency. And there have been a lot of Jewish sects, sects, little offshoots of groups that were doing different things with Judaism. And they said, we've got to cut all that off, and we've got to remain centrally core to our beliefs. So they went and called all these different sects to see if they were going to come back or they were going to cut them off for real. And one of these groups was the Christians who had been living in and working and praying. They would pray on Saturday in the synagogues as Jews, and then Sunday they would do a little extra for their Christianity. So the Jews are like, "Hey, Christians." Christians are like, "Yeah, what's up?" And they're like, we want to know if you will return back to Judaism and join us, or whether or not you're going to go off on your own. And the Christians are like, well, isn't that going to require us to give up on this whole Jesus is the Messiah thing? And yeah, afraid that's the case. And they're like, well, sorry, we're too far down that rabbit hole. Sorry, we're gonna have to pass. And so the Jews are like, okay. And so after they made all those phone calls, they made a list and they sent it to Rome to say, okay, these groups are not part of who we are, and so they're not covered by this waiver, right? And so now the Christians were now the persecution began, right? So so now local synagogues became the centers of worship, and synagogues were even set up with aspects of the temple. The buildings were kind of pointed toward Jerusalem. They had a cupboard where they would put the scrolls of the law in it. And so they lost the temple, but you had like little synagogues, little churches that were kind of like mimics of the bigger temple. So now let's talk about Jewish worship for a minute. Okay, there's a rabbi. He's the leader and the religious teacher. Then you're talking about a cantor, and he's the leader of the services. And it looks like we're out of time, so we'll have to catch with the last one next.